Hello everyone, I am Amanda. I am a Ditto Education Specialist. Today on this live, I'm going to be going over button plackets and tips and tricks for really nice professional looking collars. The pattern I'm using today is the Austin shirt, which is one of the button down or the button front shirts you can find in our Ditto pattern library. So check that out. And a bunch of the a bunch of the tips I'm going to show you today can work with a lot of our other shirt patterns. So it's not just for the Austin shirt, but that's the one I'm going to make today. It's a classic standard fit men's button front shirt with a stand collar. I'm going to just give everyone a moment to join. If you want, feel free to let us know where you're watching from, or what I like to know is what's on your sewing table. So share with me what pattern you're making or what you're working on. And I'm just going to give you one more moment and then we're going to get started. I'm super excited. All right, so let's move on to the cutting table. Give me one moment and we'll start getting our ditto up. Cheryl says hello from Florida. Hi, Cheryl. All right, and as we go along, feel free to give us questions or anything like that in the chat. I love hearing what you're thinking or what you need clarification on. So like I said, today we are working on the Austin shirt and we are doing button plackets and collars. So I have this shirt partially done already because I want to get focused on to the good stuff, which is those button plackets. So first things first, I want to talk about marking your button plackets and how the Ditto pattern button plackets specifically work. A few of our plackets are, added on facings or a strip that you add on, but a good majority of them are self plackets, which means if you can see on here, these lines, the placket itself to finish it is actually included in the pattern. So because I already have this cut out and partially sewn, I just wanted to lay this on here so you can see. And I'm going to talk you through some of the best practices just to get a really nice button placket here. So I'm lining this back up. And I don't know if you can see in the video, but I already drew some of these lines here. So I'm just lining those back up. And one important note, so if you, let me switch screens for a moment to my screen here. When you are in the workspace, know that the way that the Ditto patterns, especially these men's shirts, are projected, it's projected what would go on the front of the shirt. So if you're like me and you have the wrong side up, because that's where I want to put my lines, be sure to mirror the image. And if you're not sure how to do that, on the bottom here, you just hit mirror and you're able to switch it. So I already mirrored this. All right, here we go. So this is my left side, and generally with men's shirts, they go left over right. Women's are right over left. But of course, this is your shirt, so you can do whatever you want. Judy says, I love all the Ditto patterns. Yes, Judy, me too. So this is the left shirt, and I already have my lines drawn here, but I'm gonna go in and just show you how I went about that. So I just have a long ruler here, and I just took my marker and drew my lines there. So you can see I just did this part in purple. It's a little bit darker. However you want to mark your shirt, just make sure it's something that will wash out. So this left side here is already marked. And I want to show you the other side. So I'm going to clear this and bring in this other one. And it because I'm putting this onto my wrong side of my fabric. So let me send this. right, and you can see here, if I line this up, I already put my lines here, but this would be the moment when you're cutting this out while you're marking all of your notches to mark these lines here. So on this right side, there's actually 3 lines. On the left side, there are 4, and 3 of them are very close to each other. Okay, so now that we did that, I want to cut out, because I want to just do all the ditto stuff first. All of our cutting, like we normally would with a project, is cut first, then do our sewing. So now that I showed you all those markings on the fronts, I want to talk a little bit about cutting out your collars and best practices, and then we'll come back to putting that placket together. Okay. All right, so I'm going to clear this, and I'm bringing, just confirming I have the right screen there for you. Great. So I'm going to bring my collars in here, and you can orient them as however you want. I'm cutting on a single layer, so I'm going to bring all my pieces out here for my collar. You can put them however you want. That's what I love about Ditto, like this workspace is your own, so put them together however you feel is useful for your fabric. I do want to make a note, if you are someone who is using a fabric that is directional, so like mine here, I have this fabric that has these sailboats on it. So my fabric is directional, and what I like when I make a button front shirt is obviously I want those sailboats or whatever you have in your pattern to be going down the entire shirt. So one of my collars is going to stand up, but I actually like when my under collar, if you popped that up, the sailboats also go down. So if that's something you want to do, all you want to do is mirror just one of these. Patterns are all going the correct direction. All right, so I'm happy with that. I'm going to send this over. Okay, great. All right, and you can all see this. Let me close the window just a little bit to get it a little darker in here. That's better. Okay, great. So today I'm not going to be focusing on matching anything or anything like that. So I am just going to lay this nicely how I feel I like it on all those pieces, and if I was cutting this for myself, I might shift each piece as I go. All right. So I'm happy with that. I'm going to put my weights down and start cutting. And sometimes with these smaller pieces, the weights don't necessarily fit in between. I have my rotary cutter here, which if you use scissors, that's fine as well. I get that question a lot, do I have to use a rotary cutter? No, you don't have to use a rotary cutter with Ditto. Just if you're going to use scissors, make sure you keep the blade down on that mat. That's going to be really helpful for you to get an accurate line. And see if my fabric's moving there, what I might want to do is put my weight a little closer and just okay, and this is a really great moment to mark all your notches. And collar stands have a lot of them. So we're just going to get all of this in here, just like that. Now, I did not mirror this one, so if I were to put these together, this and this should be switched. However, they're identical pieces when you cut them out, so it's okay. All right, so again, I'm going through and I'm doing all my markings as I work. Especially when doing a collar or something like this, all of these are super important to collar. Okay, so my two stands are cut out, and like I said, I have these two flipped, so depending on how they sit in the shirt, they will either popped collar will look nice or low will look nice. And you can see, like I said, I'm not matching any patterns today, but this is, I mean, that's what I love about Ditto, is that matching patterns kind of is fun because you can see everything that you're working on. You're not fighting with paper. All right, almost there. So there's another one, and this last one. And if you're like me and this is just too far to cut, that's what, I'm just gonna bring this down. Right. And see, now that's easier for me to reach, so I don't have to stretch over my table. Okay. Whoop. And be careful of your fabric moving, so make sure everything stays on your table. I know a lot of us, when we're cutting, you let your fabric hang off. Sometimes that'll actually make your fabric stretch, and then when you actually finish your piece, it's slightly different size. So it's always good to keep all your fabric on the table and make sure that there's no tension of it. All right, and again, I can move this as needed to make sure this is all lined up and get my notches in there. All right, so my collar is cut out, and like I said before, my shirt is already cut out. So let's do our interfacing. All right, so I'm gonna clear that out. I love that this is all organized for me, so we'll give that a second. Here we go. And same thing, I'm just gonna bring these in and set them in here. And this one, because we're not worried about a pattern, we can just pop these in here. And I'm bringing in all of these. If you want to cut on the fold or cut on a double layer, you totally could, but I'm gonna bring all of these in. All right, so here's my pieces. I'm actually going to, okay, great. All right, so now a little bit about interfacing when doing shirts and things like that. I am using a non-woven fusible interfacing. It's 20 inches, which is generally wide enough for most collars. You could, because it's not woven, you could also cut it like this. That's the really nice thing about non-woven interfacing, is you don't have to worry about a grain line. And that's what I like almost like a cotton weight fusible interfacing, and your grain is slightly off. It's actually going to pull your shirt collar a little bit and might mess with the way that it lays on the body. So if you're gonna use a woven interfacing, just make sure you're really paying attention to grain line as you cut. But if you're using a fusible non-woven interfacing, and I've got a little that in my pieces here. If I had a paper pattern, I wouldn't have seen that. So I'm gonna start cutting my interfacing, and just like the other one, I'm going to, and I'm doing this, I'm gonna mark it on my right side, so as it's fused to my pieces, I can still see all my markings really clearly. And another note about interfacing, when you're picking out interfacings for shirts, you always want to pick out an inner fabric. You don't want a super lightweight shirt with a heavy interfacing. You could always have a heavier shirt with a lighter interfacing, but you always want to go lighter or something that feels similar. So this is a little bit lighter than the chambray that I got for this shirt, but it's going to feel really nice. So, and we have a question. Vicky said, is this for the interfacing? Don't you need one piece? So Vicky, for ditto patterns, we do it 2 of each. And I know for some people when they're making shirts, and I'm going to cut this as I'm talking, as they're making shirts, they'll only interface either one, like the outer side of the collar stand, or only the over collar and not the under collar. Today I'm trying to show you what's best when you're beginning, and I find that interfacing all the pieces just makes it a little bit easier to get a crisper collar. I also find that it stabilizes my fabric a little bit so I don't have to worry about it moving around. Outer stand and your outer collar, by all means. But I personally, ditto patterns or not, I like to interface all pieces and just use a lighter weight interfacing. And that way I know everything's really secure and sturdy and I get a nice crisp collar. So that is a choice. A lot of patterns are, and how people make shirts is different no matter like what pattern you're looking at. You can do it however you want. All right, so I'm just going through and marking all this. Now, one change I am going to make to the interfacing that's actually going to help you moving forward is on just one of these stands, I'm going to remove some of the seam allowance ahead of time. And we're going to use this in the final step. So this is something I'm adding on that's not in your ditto pattern's final step of the collar. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to, before cutting, I'm just measuring my 5/8 seam allowance. And again, only doing this on one of those stand collar patterns. Okay, great. You see that there? And make sure you bring up these markings here. So finished stand. And now I'm cutting on my new line. Again, if you prefer to just follow the instructions and you want to ignore this little step, you absolutely can. But I find that this is super helpful just to have one of them with that seam allowance removed. Okay, and I did not mark my notches, so I want to get this back into place. Okay, got this. I just want to trim some of this off, especially with your collar stands. The more accurate, the better. So there we go. That looks nicer. Okay. All right, and now I'm working on this one, and these I'm not going to change anything to. Sometimes when doing shirt interfacing, people may say, oh, well, you know, I don't want that seam allowance to bulk it up, so I don't want to do my interfacing for the whole piece. I just want to interface the actual part I'll be sewing. That's totally fine too. I don't, because I'm using this very lightweight interfacing, I don't find that it bulks up my collars or anything at all, so I'm using it as is. All right, and last one. All right, so now all of those are good to go. And let's, I know I'm jumping back and forth, but I wanted to get everything cut out first and show you that. So let's move on to making these button plackets, because we obviously need to finish the front of the shirt before we move on to, I'm just turning on my lights, sorry about that. All right, lights are going on. And I'm going to turn off my Ditto just so that isn't in the way of what you're seeing. All right, so let's do the button plackets. So a lot of the button plackets, what's going to be important is all the prep. So all your ironing prep is what's going to be super helpful. That and our lines that we drew on our fabric. All right, so this is one of my shirt fronts here, and this is my right side. So I like starting with the right side only because it's a little bit easier to just like get in the mindset and understand what you're doing. So here's my right side of the shirt, and I have these 3 lines set here. And for this right side, all we're gonna do is we're gonna start by ironing this one piece over. So towards the inside of the shirt. And you're gonna fold on the line, and it's actually, for this pattern, this matches up that raw edge to that next line. Now, if you're someone who you want a little bit of a more sturdy placket, you could put a strip of interfacing in here just to give a place for your buttons to have a little bit of stability. I find, because I'm making this like nice light summer shirt, that to have that movement and nothing really structured down the front is my preference. Also in the instructions for Ditto, there's, sorry, also in the Ditto instructions, it doesn't say anything about interfacing this placket. So we're not going to, but if that's something you've done in the past, then absolutely feel free to do it if you feel that your garment needs some structure. All right, so as you can see, I ironed this and I ironed it right in that fold. That's where that first line was. And now I'm doing the next one. And that's why it was really important to draw those lines and take time to draw those lines, because that's what's setting you up for success, to have a really nice even front. And using those fabric markers, be sure, when you use the fabric markers, to do a little test and confirm that it does wash out of your fabric, because it's not going to wash out of all of them, but because this is a chambray that I specifically picked to wash, I know it comes out. But what I like about it is I can kind of see these lines. You might not be able to see it, but some of my lines actually come through the front. So it's really easy for me to line up. So this is the right side, and this is all set. I ironed it, I feel good about it. So I'm gonna just put some pins in here to hold it in place, and we can move on to the other side. And before I cut this all out, I did wash it and dry it and iron it. So that's really important when doing any kind of garment construction. You want to make sure that if it's a washable fabric or it's going to go to dry cleaning, that it's been either pre-dry cleaned or pre-washed so that it doesn't shrink after you make it. All right, so right side is all done. I'm going to move on to the left side. And this is the one that's a little more tricky. But I think once I show it to you, it will make sense. So this is the left side of the shirt. Oh, and we have a comment. Vicky says, how about just ironing, interfacing onto a whole block of fabric and then cutting once? You could totally do that. I think that's a great idea, to just skip those 2 steps of cutting out all those pieces. You can totally iron Just make sure you have a big enough piece, iron it to your fabric really well, and then cut them directly. All right, so on the left side, I'm doing the same thing. I'm folding this over on my line. Excuse me. I said excuse me, and it's because I tapped the iron. All right. All right, so I'm just working my way down, and I'm taking the time to check my line as I go. And this is something that if you prefer to, you could draw all these lines on the front and then you'll be able to see them. I find that I just like to kind of work and see it as is, but you can do those lines on the front. All right. Great, so I've got this piece folded over and ironed. And now I'm actually going to fold this over again. There's a few ways to get to this next step. I'm going to fold this over again, just so this raw edge is here, and you should just make sure that you still have one more line. If you're folding it, you've got one more line here. And I've got some questions. The sailboats are perfectly aligned. Oh, thank you. And another one, if I use chalk wheel, does that cause a problem? I don't think so. I think, what's important is to use the tools that you enjoy using. So if you use a chalk wheel, go for it. I think that's great. I sometimes find that when I use chalk, it disappears too quickly for something like this. I do want a little bit of it to still be there, just for a bit, because this is a little bit of we want to get this all right. So here you can see this has been folded in, and I just want to double check that my raw edge is really sitting in here, because the next thing I'm going to do is actually flip this so that this sits like this, okay? And so I just wanted to show it you that way, but you can actually do it this way and bring this piece over. So I'm actually folding again on this last line there. I hope you can see it. I'm gonna bring this in, see if I can zoom a little bit for you. Let's see if this will work. Not really. Well, maybe you can see here, there's that little line. So what I'm doing is I'm bringing that line forward to cover my raw edge there. So I'm just taking my time working down with my iron to get that. And this is just one way to do a facing or to do a placket with the Ditto patterns. Like I said, there's a few that are a little piece that you're gonna sew on. There's a few that are part of the facing. So just read your instructions, but I find this one's really nice that it's attached to the shirt as one, and I feel like it creates a really nice finish. So check out some of those shirts and see which one's your favorite. Okay, so this is what it looks like on the wrong side. This little piece is folded over. This is what it looks like on the right side. So I've got this even strip here, just like that. All right, and when I'm happy with this, I'm gonna put my pins in. And it's really important that I get through all layers, because when we sew this, that's what's gonna lock that raw edge inside this tiny little fold. The other side is that one's easier because it's just fold twice, so there's nowhere for that raw edge to pop out. But this one we wanna be very meticulous with and make sure that it gets encased in some stitching. All right, and how many pins you do is up to you. Okay, so now that I have both of these pinned, I feel good about how they are laying. Let's take them to the machine and we're gonna stitch them. So, and you can see here, that's one side and this is the side that's gonna go over. So that will work out great. All right, so let's move on to the machine. All right, and I am just using a straight stitch for this. I'm gonna be using that for pretty much everything today. And I wanted to talk about just a few ways to get a nice looking top stitch on your shirts. And we'll be dealing with different amounts as we go forward. But on this button down shirt, this front here, it can kind of be wherever. So I like to start, or wherever you like, not wherever, wherever you like to have your top stitching, how close you like it to the edge. So I like starting, this is my right side, so this is the front of the fabric. I like starting on the wrong side of my right piece, just so I can get kind of a feel for how things are going. And I'm gonna show you the most basic way, and then how your machine can help you with this top stitching. So right now, I'm just gonna do a little bit of a stitch, and what I'm using just to keep track of where my stitches are is I'm just watching my foot here. So this is the standard zigzag foot for my machine. And I like that it has a little clear window. So I'd say if you're gonna use some kind of standard foot, just make sure that you can clearly see what's going on there, or you can see underneath the clear foot. So I like this one. I also like these little, if you can see it, these little red markings here. I can kind of use those as a guide. So for this one, I'm not looking at my needle, I'm looking at this red dot on my foot and where it correlates to the edge of the fabric. And I'm just taking my time here and going through. So this is the most basic way to do top stitching, is just watching and paying attention to where the edge of the fabric falls. You're not looking at your needle, you're looking at your feet and the edge of your fabric. And the nice thing about starting with that right side is this is the part, what I'm sewing right now is going to be covered. So if I mess it up, that is totally fine. Well, totally fine for me, I'd be okay with it. But it's a good starting point just to get into the zone of top stitching and knowing what you're doing. Okay. All right, so that's one way to start your top stitching, is just to use a standard foot and just get started. I want to show you another option, which is, so for my machine, this is a bi-level foot, which means one side is a little bit lower than the other. And what's great about this is it's specifically made for top stitching. Now, depending on what machine you have, it might look a little different, or your machine might not have it at all. So it's really great to look into your machine, what kind of machine you have, and see if there's a foot specifically made for top stitching. That's really gonna help you in this situation. So for this one, the fabric, the higher fabric is always going to be on the right here, and my fabric edge is gonna just sit in this groove. And I still have a very wide hole to see what I'm doing. And I also have this little red mark here that tells me where my edge of the fabric is. So I really love this foot for this. And I can look at it and it's actually a little further in than my other one, and I kind of want them to match. So what I'm going to do is just use some positioning on my machine to move that over. That's what's great about having that wide hole there, is I'm able to set how far from the edge I'm sewing. Okay, I'm happy with this. So now I'm still watching what's going on as I top stitch, but now I have the assist of this foot, which is really nice and helpful. So it's just like a little extra bonus there. I feel like I can go a little bit faster. All right, so this is what it looks like on that front there, this right side that we're not going to see because this is the side our buttons go on, but that's really nice and even. So that's a really great way to finish that side. And then let's move on to the left side, which is the one we are going to see. What I'm going to do is just leave my settings exactly the same so everything is even. Now, if I wanted this, again, if I wanted this to be a little more one side or the other, I can just position it. So I'm doing the same thing. I'm top stitching now. This is the left side that has only that little tiny piece folded over to protect the raw edge. So this stitch is very important on this side. And I'm left-handed, so sometimes my pins, you'll see, go the wrong direction as I'm sewing, but I just make a point to pull them out, like right here. Just pull this out before I go. All right, and I'm getting to the end here. I don't recall if I said this before, but if you see, I always do a little back stitch. When garment making, like, this stuff takes so much wear and tear. You're putting it in the wash or you're wearing it out. So back stitch whenever you can, wherever you can. It's just gonna help your garment last longer. Okay, so as you can see for my left side here, that is that top stitching we just did. It's really even because of that bi-level foot, but of course you could do that with just eyeballing it or any other kind of top stitching foot. And then that is what that back looks like. So it's just catching that little fold there, and my raw edge is encased inside there. So that's all good to go. And the last thing I'm going to do is now just run. You could leave it at this, but I'm going to run a little top stitch just on the other side so it all matches. All right. There we go. Okay. All right, so now both my plackets are done. They both look beautiful. The top stitching is even, everything's secure. So last thing I want to do while I'm at, oh, there you go. Last thing I want to do while I'm on my machine is I'm just going to run a stay stitch around this collar. That's going to help us when placing the collar that this doesn't get stretched out. We've already been using it a little bit. If I wasn't sewing this for the sew along, I would probably do my button plackets and put my pockets on before attaching my yoke, but I wanted to have something kind of ready to go. So let me take this foot off and go back to our standard foot here. Whoop. There we go. Okay. And because this is 5/8 of an inch, I'm going to do this little baste, or this little stay stitch at a 1/2 inch, just so I don't have to worry about it getting in my way. This is also going to help when you have your yoke on here, because your yoke is 2 layers. This is going to just keep your yoke in place while you're working. You don't have to worry about that 2-layer there. All right. Great. Okay, so let's move on let's move to the table. All right, so you can see here, my placket is all done. If you want to take a moment and give this a little press, that might be a good idea, but if you pressed it well, depending on your material, it might already be really nice. But doing lots of pressing as you work is always really helpful. All right. So, plackets are done. They're going to be really nice when they're all lined up. And something I love about Ditto, so my markings actually came through, which is right here. But if you did not mark your buttonholes as you went, how easy is it just to project your piece again, lay it underneath, and mark those holes. So if there's time, I'll show you that, but I absolutely love that if I forget to mark them, I just turn my projector back on and mark my holes. It's great. Okay, so let's put these collars together. So we already cut out all of our pieces. So our priority now is going to be ironing all of this. All right, and I have my 2 collar pieces here that are going opposite directions because I have a directional fabric, and I'm just going to give everything an extra nice press before putting my interfacing down, because if you have it a little bit wrinkly, and that wrinkle gets caught in the fusing, it's going to be there permanently. So you really want to make sure that everything is nice and smooth, and it's good when you're doing interfacing to heat up your fabric a little bit, just like that. Okay. And like Vicki said, Vicki's idea, if you want to just cut a panel of interfacing already interfaced, then you would have already had this done. So I'm just giving this a good press. And depending on what interfacing you're using, some are going to be easier than others. And this is the fusible lightweight, Pellon fusible lightweight that I'm using. It's non-woven, which is great if I don't have to worry about grain lines as I'm putting this on. And I find it washes pretty well as long as I press it really well. So you should find your preference. Quite a few of the interfacings are good for shirts. It's just a question of finding what you like. There's one called, I think, Sure Tailor, which is like specifically made for shirts and collars. I haven't been able to find it in stores, but I really want to try that one. At the end, I'm really happy with this. This fusible always works for me, especially for summer weight relaxed shirts like this. You might want to go a little bit more structured if you're doing like a proper dress shirt. All right, so I'm just giving these a good press. And it's always good to read the instructions of your interfacing. Like this one says use a slightly damp cloth. I find that just using steam really helps get that secure. But some of them won't want you to use steam. So make sure that you read those instructions and you know what kind of interfacing you're using. All right, and this is the one with lots of notches, so I just want to make sure my notches are all lined up. While I'm ironing this, I have a fun fact. I don't know if you all know this, the difference between a button front shirt and a button down shirt. So some of us think that it's interchangeable, and generally when you're talking about it, it is, but actually a button down shirt is referring to the fact that the collar has buttons to button it down to the shirt. So if you ever see a shirt with collar button, like buttons on the edge of the collar, that is a button down shirt. And then any shirt that has buttons up the front is a button front shirt. All right, and here's this piece that I cut the seam allowance off. So you can see here, I'm just gonna line up this front, or this top, excuse me, there we go, before ironing it. So this is one where, and again, this was like just a little added tip I gave you to kind of help you on a future step. But this is a part where if you, interface just a whole panel and then cut it out, you wouldn't be able to do this. Only because pulling this fusible up can be a little tricky. Okay, those feel good. I gave them a good press. So let's get to the fun part, which is making our collars. So I'm gonna set those pieces aside, and I'm gonna start with this collar here. And the piece where you would think it's upside down, basically your upside down pattern, that is actually your top collar, because that's the one that when it sits on the body is going to fold down like this. So this is my top collar. The other one is my bottom collar, and I'm just gonna line these up. If you have a fabric that is non-directional, then it won't really matter which one's your top and the bottom at this moment. But I like to mark my seam allowance on these as I go. So this is completely optional, but I find giving myself a guide makes all the difference in making these collars match up. So I'm just using any kind of clear ruler just to mark my lines here. And what's most important, honestly, is these points here. So if you see, oh, I was a little out of frame. Sorry about that. Here, I'm going to zoom out a little bit. There we go. So if you see here, like these aren't perfect, that's okay, because I'm also going to use my sewing machine. This is just like my backup here. So when doing something really precise, you want to just have all the guidelines and all the things at your disposal. So I have my grain line or my seam allowance drawn on here, and I'm also going to pay attention to my machine. But these 2 points are what's most important when doing this. All right, and then I'm gonna just throw some pins in here. And while I'm pinning, I've got a question. Yeah, Judy, also a lefty. So Judy asked, if I want to make this shirt for me, would you suggest cutting the front mirrored to begin with so the placket lines of the buttonholes are on the left? Yeah, so you actually, depending if you're the type of person that cuts things with the right side up or the wrong side up when you cut, you just want to check that. So how the patterns are, at least what I've noticed on this shirt, but check your pattern. As I'm talking, I'm going to go to the machine. So with those patterns, I find that the way they show up on the workspace is if you were drawing them on the right side of the fabric. So when I did this shirt, because I was cutting on the wrong side of the fabric, I already mirrored them to start. So if you are making you want to make it right over, you can just turn the workspace on and cut it with the wrong side up and you should be good to go. But just double check. I mean, project that piece and just take a moment to think about it. Okay, if I lifted this up, this is going to end up on my left side of the body. So this is the front or the not front, depending on who I'm doing it for. And Judy, I will say, I put this shirt on my women's dress form and it's super cute. It has a really nice cut for anyone. So I'd say it's unisex and everyone should make one. Okay, so I am currently starting to sew this collar as is. Oh, here we go. And I'm paying attention to my 5/8 mark on my machine here. But I'm also looking at my lines, and here is why those lines are important. When you get to this corner, what you actually want to do is you want to set your machine so that, especially when you're doing top stitching or anything really precise, set your needle to go down, then you'll be able to pivot. And I know the instinct is to pivot right away and start going, but if you actually do one stitch walking over and then continue, you're gonna get a nicer point. You barely can tell when sewing it, but you'll get a slightly nicer point. The thicker the fabric, the more walks you'll have to do. So because this is super lightweight, I just did one stitch walk before continuing. On a lightweight fabric, if you don't walk it, you're probably not gonna notice, but it's a nice little, it just helps that corner. Okay, so I'm just sewing and I'm getting close here and I'm doing a walk and I'm heading back down here. Okay. Okay, so now let's, I think you can see this here. We're gonna cut our seam allowance. Let me grab scissors. So to cut this seam allowance, I like to grade my seam allowance, and that means that one seam allowance is gonna end up shorter than the others, and that just makes a smoother finish here. So what I like to do is just start by cutting one of them really short, just like that. If you have applique scissors, this is a fantastic use of those applique scissors or those duckbill scissors, if you can see that. Here, I'll show you there. Because that's just going to hold that other seam allowance out of the way. And I find cutting the shortest one first is helpful than trying to cut them both and then cut one down even shorter, because right now I have plenty of fabric behind my scissors to kind of keep it out of the way as I cut. And this can be, because I have this fabric that has a little bit of embroidery in it, whenever I hit a sailboat, it gets a little angry. There we go. Okay, and then I want to come in here and just cut this just a little bit further there, like that. And you do want to cut this point. And depending on how severe your point is, you could cut even more, but you want to cut as close as you can to this point. All right, and while I'm cutting, I'm going to head over to the table because we will iron this. All right, so that's my nice graded collar. And I can start turning this inside out. And some tricks for turning this nicely. You want to just get your finger in there and get it pushed out as much as possible. And then you can use, I have this little bamboo tool that you can use. You could also use like a blunt pencil or something. You definitely don't want to use scissors, because you're going to go right through your point and that would be disappointing. So use a tool specifically made for making points. Another little trick that I think I've showed before that I love to do is you just grab a needle and thread, and I have a double layer here, and I just slide it into a tiny bit of that point. I'm trying to get this in the camera there. And just give it a gentle tug. And then I can release it. And that just gets my corner even more nice and secure. So just a tiny bit in the top there. And we're good. Yeah, and when you do that, you don't want to do too little because you might just pull out a thread instead of the corner. Okay. All right, so now that this is like this, we want to iron this. If you would like, you can press this middle open a little bit to start. That always helps get a nice edge. But then you can move to closing this and ironing it. And what I like to do is I actually like to start with the under collar up, because I can kind of roll my pieces in towards the other collar just a bit. And that way, whatever's on the outside is going, you're not going to see like the two layers of collar, if that makes sense. And I can show that to you in a moment. So I'm just, let me come in a little bit so I can see here. So yeah, I'm just rolling this slightly towards me, and that way I see that seam where it's sewn, and that's going to end up on the underneath. So give that a press, and then I come out here and I give this a press. And if you notice, I didn't go over these collar points once I'm on my top fabric. Oh, sorry, let me zoom out again. Jeez, all right. Okay, so I didn't iron these points when I'm on the right side of my collar, that upper collar, because no matter how clean you think your iron is, if you go over one of these edges and there's like a little bit of rust or gunk in your iron, your corners could pick it up and they'll be forever dirty. So as a precaution, I always just take a little scrap fabric or a pressing cloth and go over those corners. It also protects your collar from getting that like burnished fabric look. It's just a very delicate area of your project. Okay, so now we can put these together. They look pretty good and matching up. So now I'm going to do my top stitching on this. Okay. So for my top stitching, same thing. I could use that bi-level foot. I could use my regular foot. All right. Just make sure my stitch is in good shape. Something you may want to do to help you get this really nice point is take a moment, if you're using something washable, take a moment to draw your 5/8 seam allowance, your little dot here. So or whatever you're going to do, you want to just put a dot. So you might want to measure it if you're doing like a 1/4 inch. 1/4 inch here. So I might actually put mine right there. And same thing over here. Doing this little 1/4 inch mark. You can just check it. All right, I feel good about that. That's just gonna help you get even top stitching. It's not necessary, but I like to put a little point. Also, if you have a 1/4 inch quilting foot that has like an edge on it, this is a really great time to pull that out. That's a really great foot to be able to go do this top stitching. So again, you could use multiple types of feet. For me, I'm just using the edge of my foot here as my guide for this top stitching. And I think that's what's important. You want to choose whatever works for you. So what works for me might not work for you. All right, and again, I have my needle set that it goes down. That's really helpful for top stitching, and I can turn. And the nice thing about your needle being already in that position, say you want to go one more stitch, you didn't lose that position. So I went one more stitch, that feels nice, and I can keep going. All right. Yeah, so I'm just watching this edge as I go, but you could be using that quilting foot as well. All right, and I'm gonna test, and that seems like a good pivot. So I'm gonna go here. Ooh, all right. Make sure you don't accidentally step on the pedal as you're sewing, or not sewing in my case. All right, so let's add, let's now move to the table and attach our stand collar. We're getting close. All right, so here's my collar top stitched. And I want to attach this stand collar, and this is the one that is, sometimes it's nice just to visualize it, so put it all together. I like this one to go in here. Like that's gonna be my inside. So this needs to go like this. So we're gonna work on sandwiching these pieces, and of course they're not matching shapes. So I like to take one at a time and match up the notches of one piece here. All right, so I got one piece on. This is a time if you want an extra guidance. Ooh. Extra guidance while you are sewing, just like we did for the collar where I drew that 5/8 seam allowance on. You might want to do this here. This is really helpful. Again, having a guide, especially on this curve, is going to be really helpful. You could even just do it past that mark, and that way I know that that is that collar stand side, and I'm going to do this one. If you have a hem ruler, this would also be really helpful for that. So I can just look at these and feel good about that, okay? So now that I got that on there, I can put this one here. So we're just sandwiching our collar in this collar stand. And I already pinned one side, and I'm just gonna realign, pull out those pins as I go. And you can see I start in the center, and then I always do my notches next because those are what's important. And then you can kind of pull and shift to make sure everything fits, although it should fit here. Okay, so matching up that. All right, so now this is all in place. One last thing I want to do, and I actually should have done this before pinning it, just to make my life a little easier, but I'm going to do it while it's pinned, just so I don't have to take that out. But for you, do this beforehand, and it'll make things a little easier. I'm going to iron up this seam allowance, so that's why I had you cut off that interfacing, because now I have a perfect guideline. Again, everything is about guidelines and setting yourself up for those really nice stitches and this really nice collar. So I have this guideline now that I can just fold this on that interfacing line. And I'm going to do this, try to do this lightly. Definitely do this before pinning it. It'll make it easier. You can also use the edge of it. There we go. All right, so I'm just giving this interfacing, or this stand, a nice press, getting that all pinned into place here, or all ironed into place. And now my stand is good to sew, and this is already where it needs to be when I attach it to my shirt. So now that I did that, last thing I'm going to pin is I just want to make sure this little flap here doesn't move. So I'll put a pin in there as well. And a pin in here. Okay, so now we can sew this. Okay. All right, and this is why this line that I made is super helpful, because I can just follow along and I get a really nice curve as I go. And again, if you have your needle in the down position, as you move, nothing will jump around. And now that I'm past that line that I drew, I'm paying attention to my 5/8 seam allowance line on my machine. This pin is backwards, so I'm going to get that back in the right shape here. Ooh, I hit a sailboat. Okay. now that I have this sewn, I'm going to just double check that everything is sitting nice. Let's go to the table and we're going to cut off our seam allowance. So now we can trim this seam allowance off if we're happy with how everything's sitting. It's always good to check before you cut seam allowance because you can't go back. So, and I'm cutting this pretty close. If you want to leave a little bit more for where the collar is, you could leave like a little bit of more seam allowance there, but I'm just cutting all of it here. You could grade this as well. I found in the stand, some of that sturdiness is actually nice. So that is a choice. And be careful when you cut the seam allowance that you don't get too close because this little piece of fabric is going to be important there. Okay, so now I can turn this right side up, or right sides out, and I'm going to give this a press. And what I want to do is pull this fabric away from that collar as I press, because we're going to top stitch that eventually, so we want that to be nice. And just work one side at a time. So, got that pressed. And same thing, I'm just pushing this or pulling it away from the collar as I go. And this is another moment where you can check to see that everything is nice and matches. And I have a little bit of this. Doing that, I notice that this needs to be popped out a little bit more. So always good to check as you go. And I also want to just double check that this that I ironed before is still sitting nicely. So this is a good time to do that, a nice little press before you move on to attaching it. Okay, so this is ready to attach. I am going to now again, I'm going to mark 5/8 seam allowance on here just because I keep finding it helpful to have my seam allowance drawn for me as a guide. And it should end up, the nice thing about if you draw it on here, it should end up exactly where this is folded over. Or just covering it would be ideal. All right, and I'm checking mine and that looks good. All right, so let's attach this to the shirt. Finally, the exciting part. All right, and this is where my notches are going to come in handy, and I'm going to line up all these notches. And the most important part to line up, I'd say like most things in garments, we want the front here to match up really well, and we want our center back, and then we can work out everything as we go. So I'm going to get this lined up and put a pin in there because this is a very important point. And same thing over here, get this point lined up. And then I can kind of shift as I go and get this piece in place using my notches as a guide. Now, because we are working with two separate shapes, I like to take a moment and baste this in place. I find that it just a lot easier to do. I tried to cut that with my rotary cutter and that was not a smooth move. Okay, that's what scissors are for. So I'm just doing one thread here. I put a little knot, and to get a really nice corner here, I'm actually going to loop it around. So if you can see that closely, I just wrapped it around. So now these two are really lined up because that's really important, and that's where a lot of collars, I feel like homemade shirts, get messed up there because either this stand will be a little further out or this will be a little further in. So you're just giving yourself a little extra help there by putting a little, almost like a knot there. And I'm just doing a quick baste through, and I'm gonna go just above my, that 5/8 seam allowance that I drew. That way, as I'm sewing it, it's a guide, but also I don't have to worry about it showing after the fact. So I'm just going just above it. And this would be helpful if you stay more flat on the table. I'm just trying to make sure you can see it. I hope everyone can see it. Just a quick baste, nothing fancy. All right. And make sure as you're basting that you're checking that nothing's getting caught back here, because you are dealing with several layers of things that are all shaped differently and wanting to go different directions. So again, we're setting ourselves up here to just let the basting do the trick. So I just gave a little loose knot there. Now that it's basted, you could totally sew this as is, but I find that with a 5/8 seam allowance in this space, I'm prone to getting little puckers or little tucks in my shirt fabric just because these are two different fabrics. So I actually like to cut my seam allowance down ahead of time before doing this. But since I'm basted in, I don't have to worry about lining up something tiny. So that is up to you if you want to take a moment, here's my scissors, to cut your seam allowance. And because the shirt is the place where you're most likely going to get those puckers, I like to work on that side. And I'm just cutting, I'm eyeballing about 1/4 inch from my basting stitch because I know my basting stitch is already inside my seam allowance. So this is a really safe amount. And because I did that, that stay stitch in there, that's still in there. So everything is still really secure in there. And now this is way more easy for me to get in the machine and make sure I don't get any puckers. All right, so now I can go to the machine. Oh, Cheryl, I'm glad you're learning something new. I hope you get very crisp, nice collars. Oop, bumped my thing there. If anyone else has some collar techniques or things that work for you, I'd love to hear what works for you. That's the cool thing about sewing, is that there's so many ways to do one thing. These are just all my ways, slash the way the instructions tell you how to do it. All right. So now I'm sewing, and because I drew that line, I don't need to worry about paying attention to my seam allowance, because I also just eyeball cut that, so I don't want to use that seam allowance as a guide anymore like I've been doing in the past. Once you cut it, unless you measured it, you want to use something else as a guide. So I'm just sewing on my line here. And I keep checking to make sure my shirt fabric is all tucked out of the way. Alrighty. So last thing before sewing this, I just want to look at the entire shirt as I go, because next step is going to be, I thought that was a pucker, but that is just the fabric being folded. So that's all good. But I just want to check that nothing got caught, because we're gonna close this up and be done. So I'm just going through and checking, and everything is lining up nicely and nothing's puckered. So now I can tuck this all in. Let's go back to the table. All right, and last step, if you can, you might want to give this just a little press. You don't have to go wild, because we're gonna do more after the fact. And if you have any other seam allowances that you want to cut down before we close this up, now's the time. So I gave that a little press. And now I'm going to just close this up, and as you can see, because we interfaced and ironed this, it's going to fold over and land exactly where we want it to. It's covering my stitches perfectly. So I'm going to actually turn it again. This is my left-handedness. I'm going to turn this and pin it upside down so that my pins end up in the right place. And take your time getting this nice, because this is where, especially this little area here, this little corner, is what everyone sees, because if you wear it closed, you see it on one side. If you wear it unbuttoned, you see it from the other side. So we want to get that really nice. And this is another reason why, like, some people will not, they don't interface this inner collar stand, but I find having that interfacing in there, it just really helps this part of lining this all up, because it's just really sturdy. It hasn't stretched out. If this was like a loose fabric, this edge could have stretched out. Okay, so I am happy with that. If you are brand new or you want it to be extra perfect, I highly recommend basting this, or just this opening here. It's just gonna make it a little easier and smoother as you go. I'm gonna take it right to the machine, just because I want to get to showing you. Okay, and for this, I'm gonna pop out that bi-level foot again, because this is perfect for what I'm doing here. Oh, let me change, sorry about that, okay. So this foot is, I feel like this is the main reason this foot exists, is for this step. So another little trick before we get sewing is don't start on your corner. I feel like we all have that idea, oh, I should start one edge or another. But if you start in the middle, center back here, one, where you overlap your stitches and everything will be hidden anytime you wear it. But also you won't get any messy blobs of thread when you get started on this like hefty corner. You know, when you go from nothing to several layers of fabric, it can get a little messed up. So start in the center here, and you don't have to be perfect. I'm just going to pick this little boat here, and I am going to move my needle to where I want it because I want to be extra close on this piece. So I move my needle here and I'm ready to go. And I'm just going to take my time. Making a collared shirt, it's just the same technique, just shifted every little bit. I have a thread here that I want to cut, okay? All right, and this is a point where if you have any thread or this transition, you might want to just use a pin to hold it in place as you get close. Again, if you basted it, it's going to do that for you. So I'm just walking it to where I like that position, and now I can pivot and go around this corner. Lynn asked, would a walking foot help for this part of the collar finish to avoid that slippage? Yeah, you could totally use a walking foot. For me, my priority is just getting this nice, smooth top stitching. That's why I generally say baste and then just do your top stitching. But a walking foot would be super great for that. Again, find what works for you. And you see here, I really slow down when I get to these curves because then I can kind of take my time walking that in place. My hand's in the way, but I just wanted to get this pin out of the way and tuck all that in as I get to this little corner there. And I feel good about that. So now I'm just pivoting. And if you need to adjust, see, this is what I said about that sometimes when you're on an edge. So I got too close to the edge there, but I just took a step and here I go. Okay. Susan said, I would not have thought to start sewing partway along the collar. Yes, that is one of my favorite little tricks, is start in the back where no one's going to see it. Same with why I start making button plackets with the underside first, the button side, because then you can like get your bearings, make it really nice the rest of the way. Okay. So now I have met up, and this is done. So I'm going to give this a good press, and our collar and our button plackets are done. All right, now I have this little thread here that I'm going to clip. Something got caught in there. All right. And this is my center there. All right. So that is the finished collar, which you can see now if I were to wear it closed like this. My sailboats are all pointing up, so it's really fun if you pop that collar, but then when I bring it down how you normally wear it, my sailboats are also down. So that's really helpful when you're doing those pieces. All right, and then the last thing I wanted to talk about with button plackets that I'm just gonna say, again, you can use your Ditto to project your piece back out and make sure you mark all those buttonholes. I'm not gonna show you buttonholes today because we all have different machines and they all work differently. So start practicing with your machine and how you do buttonholes. And if there are any last questions before we end for the day, I'm going to come back here. I'm back. So yeah, here is my shirt that I'm going to put, I'm holding it up, but here's my collar. I'm going to put my buttons on it. If there are any more questions or comments as we wrap up, but I just want to say thank you all for joining me for the Sew Along. I hope you learned some things about collars and button plackets and practice and show me what you're making. I really love seeing what everyone's making. So thank you. If there's no more questions, thank you all, and I'll see you around.